when we talk about where a world starts, what do you guys think of? What is the thing you need to start a world, or where does a world naturally begin?
So for me, the definition that I'm working off of is that to me, your world building begins as soon as your story deviates from the listener's reality.
Okay.
Which is a surprisingly broad definition the more that I think about it.
So, go ahead.
It's not a very high bar to clear. So as soon as you have a person in your story that doesn't exist, you are world building. As soon as you have a historical event that happens differently than actually happened, you are world building. But even if you are telling a true recounting of a historical event, but the listener doesn't know the surrounding context of the historical event, you are now world building. If you're trying to talk about Waterloo, then if you don't know the Napoleonic era and the surrounding context of that battle, you don't get anything out of the telling as a listener. So you now need to portray that world, and, which means you need to understand that world that you are portraying to the listener in order to actually communicate the story that you're trying to tell.
No.
Right. Now that's interesting because that's true, but we have it kind of already opens two different pathways, because in the case of writing a story in the Napoleonic era, where Napoleon is also fighting off aliens, right?
Yes.
We have a basis, which is the real Napoleon.
Yes.
And then we introduce aliens later, and we have to make that work.
Yeah.
But then there's also a world that you might start where you didn't come up with anything. I guess it's interesting because you have basically first world versus second world building of it's in this world, but versus it's not in this world. But in a sense, I feel like those two start in a different way. You know what I'm saying? Because you were talking about anytime your world deviates from the other. Did you say the reader?
From the reader.
From the reader or listener's
Reader,
reality.
Yeah, reader or listener. The person who's partaking in your world, as soon as it deviates, you are world building. But then, if you look at something like the Star War, it's an easy one. The set of Star Wars. Did he start with we're in Kansas, but now there's a laser sword? Probably not.
No, it's not necessarily.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not necessarily we start with your world and then deviate. It's just here's an entire with the Star War. Here is an entire world that completely deviates.
Yes.
There is no starting point. It began deviating.
But that's where I'm getting at. It's in a way these are two different things, because in this sense, when you're trying to tell Napoleon plus aliens. It was Cowboys versus Aliens.
It is Cowboys versus Aliens, yeah.
Terrible movie. But
you could do it with Napoleon though.
You could
Might be a better movie.
It probably would be by default. But if you did that, then you're basically starting with the real world, and then you add in a conceit, something different. Yeah. The interesting bit is that there's aliens. Yeah. Versus the Star War has to have a different kind of conceit because it has to start from nothing.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's all I'm getting.
But then by that definition, Chronicles of Narnia is a type 1 world building.
Yes, it is, because it's portal fantasy. Where you go from the real world.
You start in London, and then there's kind of cool, all of this. Now here's a world within that world.
Yes. No, it is. That's what I'm getting. Yeah. It's because there's it's just interesting. You have to kind of approach from two different ways.
Yeah.
So in both of these cases, though, we've talked about basically starting from a conceit. Now, first off, what is a conceit? Can someone give me a quick conceit definition?
A conceit is kind of what the story is built upon.
Yeah.
What makes this world different than something else?
Okay. So it's what makes this world interesting?
Yeah, that could be.
Okay. That's an interesting one. We can come back to that because there's a world conceit, but then that might be separate from this conceit of your story that's set in it.
You can have a character conceit.
You can have a character conceit, but the conceit is what makes your world different, what makes it interesting. Do you need a conceit to come up with the world?
I think you necessarily yes, and then it's just a matter of how big of a conceit is that to deviate from
what reality
is. So even if we just had a straight biography of Napoleon, the conceit is still, here is a narrator telling you this biography. There wasn't a narrator there. So the conceit that you have to go along with is this is it's the writer's perspective
Okay.
on Napoleon. So even in something like that, there is that conceit. It's a very, very minor conceit. Whereas with Star Wars, you're like, okay, the conceit is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that there was a galaxy far, far away a
Yes.
long time ago. There are laser swords. There's this thing called Jedi. There's an empire that's doing all of these horrible things. There's a little green puppet who whacks people with a stick. You go on and on and on and on. And so there are conceits upon conceits upon conceits. The Napoleon versus Alien, it's kind of in between, where you go, okay, cool. We've got our standard, just kind of like, here's what we know. All of this is normal. Now here's the main conceit of this work, whatever it be, whether it be writing or a video or whatever. There's also aliens.
Yes.
And so, there can and probably always are multiple conceits working within any one project at any given time.
Yes.
But that makes sense. Like, obviously, you need a conceit. And in general,
At least one.
you need at
Yeah.
least one. Especially when we're talking about world building, anything outside of actual reality. It's like, why did we do it? Like, what
Yeah.
is the reason for not just telling the story in reality? There needs to be some conceit. But do we have to start there? Because, like, it's a good example with Star Wars of, like, saying that it's conceits on conceits on conceits. It makes it actually kind of complicated to look back at the beginning of, like, did he start with, we need to have a puppet that hits people with a stick who's green,
Yeah.
who will later on start flipping through the air? Like, there was a...
Yeah.
Where do you need a clear conceit to begin world building, or no?
I think it is helpful to start, especially if you are wanting to write more of a novel length or a trilogy, or anything that you are going over at length. It is helpful to have a core conceit. So the core conceit of Star Wars, we've just going to keep using that because that's what we started with, is just space opera. That is the core conceit, is just, what if people traveled through space and there were different aliens, what would happen? That's the conceit.
Yeah, and there was a Star War.
Right, and there was a Star War. Or actually, plural.
Multiples.
Yes, multiples. And so I think having something like that helps to give your story focus and a purpose. And then from there, you start creating all of these minor conceits of, like, cool, what if there was a character, but they did this? And that's where you get, cool, what if you had a little green puppet that hit people with sticks? That's like a minor conceit within this overall thing that fits within the overall thing. Like, it wouldn't, the little green puppet who hits people with sticks doesn't make sense as a minor conceit within the conceit of, this is a Napoleonic biography. It's just
That's
like,
you're just not being creative.
I don't know what's going on anymore.
I mean, but imagine you're reading about Napoleon and then halfway through the story, Yoda's there. That
Yes.
would,
that would be frustrating.
But your conceit doesn't need to be like even super well defined to get started. It can be even just like the flavor that you want to portray in your world. So for me, I had a RPG setting that I was working on a while ago, hope to pick it back up someday, called Frigates and Freebooters, right? And even just from that name, my mind conjures up these images of like a wizard standing in a crow's nest casting a fireball at an enemy ship.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like at that point, there's the conceit of the world, and everything else is now building around that conceit, and you can flesh that 1,000 different ways.
but it doesn't. But in that case, it's not. It's intentionally not super defined of like,
Yeah.
I am building a world, but there are wizards and they are on a ship. It's not like that. You just went more the vibe you wanted to portray.
Yes, I mean that you'll have that as a consequence of the vibe, but
Yes.
the idea is
Right.
it does become more than that.